And I now look to Cansu Uyguroglu, Pembroke College Secretaries Committee, to open the case for the opposition.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm sure the decision to have me, an experimental psychology student, speak on this debate about political leaders has nothing to do with the fact that I'm from Turkey. Nevertheless, I greatly appreciate this opportunity to talk about something that affects everyone here tonight: the rise of populism, authoritarianism, and the threat of a demagogue in our own backyard. The idea that it can't happen here is greatly optimistic, if not a bit arrogant. And tonight, I hope to convey to you 3 reasons why it can happen here. Firstly, I will argue that Britain has weak formal defenses against authoritarianism. The legal complexity of the British law, which Henry is very nicely speaking about, allows for ill-defined executive powers, often vague and shifting, which can work to extend the power of the executive. Secondly, I'll argue for the democratic reasons why an authoritarian leader could be voted into power here. And lastly, I'll prove that the political tactics in the UK are alarmingly similar to those in countries where authoritarian leaders are in place. Before going any further, it falls upon me to introduce the speakers on proposition tonight. You just heard from Henry Screeton, a second-year history student and a fellow member of the Secretaries Committee. While he might have slated my personality with an introduction, he hasn't had much luck being slated for the upcoming union elections so far. Nevertheless, Henry doesn't just run independently in the union, he runs independently in life. So if anyone's interested after that speech, catch him at PMP at any given Sunday. Second on proposition, we have the Right Honourable Lord Kenneth Baker, former Home Secretary and Chairman of the Conservative Party, and current member of the House of Lords. Finally on the proposition, you will hear from Dr. Sarah Mendelsohn, US Ambassador to the UN Economic and Social Council under Obama, an expert on democracy and human rights. Mr. President, these are your guests, and they're most welcome. Firstly, I want to start by arguing that the UK lacks the legal protection to stop a leader from becoming authoritarian. So I'm not going to bore you with legal jargon, which I'm obviously not qualified to explain anyway, but I'll map this out as simply as possible. Britain is one of the only countries, along with New Zealand and Israel, that doesn't have a codified constitution to protect basic rights. The most senior law is statutory law, which doesn't cover everything. In the absence of statutory law, common law comes into play, which is made by sitting judges who apply both statutory law and reasoning from earlier decisions. Therefore, when Boris Johnson attempted to suspend Parliament for 5 weeks, an act that everyone could recognize as an authoritarian act meant to go over the head of democratically elected Parliament members, there was no statutory law that deemed it illegal. While the Supreme Court did eventually announce it to be unlawful, there was no reason that they had to do that, and there was no reason that they would do so in the future on any other authoritarian act. As I watched the decision be announced, I didn't know which way it was going to go. The Supreme Court could have very well and very fairly deemed the prorogation lawful, and that's exactly what's so risky. Though the Supreme Court disagreed with Boris on this matter, there's no guarantee they will. Always. It is up to the discretion of a court due to vague and ill-defined laws rather than a formal defense against authoritarianism. It's like, just because Henry wasn't very convincing with that speech doesn't mean the next 2 speakers won't convince you. Just because the Supreme Court decided one way doesn't mean 5 years down the line, the next one will as well. Therefore, British law doesn't protect against the possibility of it happening here. Remember, I don't need to prove that it will happen, I just need to show that it can happen, and legally, yes, it can happen. Furthermore, if the legal situation wasn't permeable to authoritarianism as it is, change is coming for the worse. Turns out, no talk about the UK or politics or anything is complete without Brexit. So pardon me while I talk about it for a short amount of time. I don't intend to comment on the validity of it, just its existence. Since Britain joined the European Economic Community in 1973, European law has filled most of the legal gaps. But Brexit will remove those protections. While Israel is working on a codified constitution, Britain is one of the only advanced countries that is weakening rather than strengthening legislative power. The protection will be gone just as illiberal populism is becoming more salient around us. Therefore, how can the proposition ever dare blind people to the risk that's coming our way? Now that we've covered that it can happen here technically and legally, let's look at the reasons why it can happen here on a democratic basis. It's important to situate ourselves in the reality of today and be aware of the trends around us. Donald Trump and the White House bring so many people a sense of emergency, a sense of fear, a sense of what's happening here. But really, the Trump disaster is just a result of 50 years of constitutional decay, rather than one sudden, unpredictable event. There is no clear process from a free democracy to an authoritarian state. But as mapped out in How Democracies Die, the United States has, until 2016, resisted the attempts to undermine democracy thanks to two norms: mutual tolerance and forbearance. Forbearance is the intentional restraint of one's power to respect the spirit of the law, if not its letters. We've already recognized that Boris Johnson has no intention to show forbearance. What's more is that mutual toleration is also at a decline. We're facing a country and a world where these norms are decaying. Western democracies currently face the threat of a disaffected, disenfranchised working class that has been left behind by modern politics, that is over mutual toleration, and that tend towards ideas that populist leaders help address. People are more disenfranchised ever due to solid facts. Rise in tuition prices, rise in home prices, increase in wealth inequality. For such a wealthy country, it is shocking that more than a fifth of the population live on incomes below the poverty line, even though most of these households are in work. Wealth inequality is much worse, with 44% of the UK's wealth owned by 10% of the population. As the fifth most unequal country in Europe, the established UK government hasn't answered to the public. What's more is that a large number of institutions that were supposed to protect poor people have been turned against them, from rich lobbyists working against the common good to gerrymandering for more seats in the parliament. This adds to the large threat to liberal democracy coming from the increasing belief that democracy has let the public down. Liberal democracy is a time-tested system for managing political disappointment, as NYU professor Stephen Holmes phrases it. This system allows for those in power to be voted out once the public has lost patience with them. But there's a rise in political disappointment. Anyone can agree, no matter what side of Brexit you're on, that the current affairs around Brexit is politically disappointing. And democracy's ability to manage this disappointment isn't rising, and in fact, it's decreasing. With increasing student loans, rising wealth inequality, and instability of the future of the country, it is no surprise that many people now turn to a strongman leader instead. The proportion of Brits who support a strongman leader has increased from 25% in 1999 to 50%. The younger generation of Brits are much more critical of democracy than the people of the same age 20 years ago. And with such a trend, a risk of a populist, authoritarian leader who gives the public simple answers for issues that democracy hasn't been answering is real. Lastly, while the general public might be migrating towards the belief that liberal democracy is not to be trusted, the politicians aren't standing by either. Politicians are exploiting the rational and irrational fears in order to further their political agendas. Pembroke's very own Viktor Orban of Hungary, America's Trump, Poland's Duda, all bet their campaign on anger and fear. Fear of job security due to immigration, anger towards the European Union, fear of their country losing global power. There's a common theme here. All of these people have proven to take their countries to more authoritarian extremes, with Orban, and I quote, saying, "Hungary needed to part with the liberal notion that people are free to do anything that doesn't violate another person's freedom." He basically said people should not be that free. If that quote doesn't generally scare you yet, it should. These countries voted in nationalist, Eurosceptical, radical people. Think of our current leader of the UK. Nationalist, Eurosceptical, and radical. How can anyone claim that we are safe from it? While I've mostly talked about the reasons why it can happen here and why it might happen here, there's also the reality that it's subtly happening already. Not only does the prorogation case show the vulnerability of British law to authoritarians, it shows that Boris Johnson has authoritarian tendencies. While he might not have been successful this time, he intended to make an authoritarian move. We currently have a leader of the country, and this is important, who intends to be authoritarian. If this isn't reason enough to worry that it very well can happen here, I don't know what is. So throughout my speech, I've highlighted the way it can happen on a technical level, the way it can happen on a democratic level, and even taken a step further to show you the way that it's already happening. And remember, for you to vote in opposition tonight, I don't need to prove that it's happening. I don't need to prove that it's very likely to happen. I just need to prove that it can happen here. It's fundamentally key, on a more somber note, it is very fundamentally key for us to recognize that it can happen here, to be able to deal with the threat of it coming. The very thought that it can't happen here, the thought that is very comforting and optimistic, that one's country is immune to authoritarian takeover, is what sets ground for it to happen in the first place. Therefore, I urge you tonight to vote in opposition of this complacent idea. Thank you.